It is my great pleasure to welcome our first speaker, who is Ria Benaflor, and her presentation will be entitled Policy Evaluation on the Implications to Human Security with Full Devolution of LGUS of DSWDS Sustainable Livelihoods Program in Marawi City in the Mindanao province of the Philippines. Let me just quickly do an introduction. Ria Benaflor is currently the Chief of Party of YouthWorks Philippines, a private sector-led employability program initiated by the United States Agency for International Development and new nonprofit organizations, the Philippines Business for Education program. Ria is a practicing phonetic and bridging senior executive leader, formerly with the Department of Social Welfare and Development, where she was an assistant secretary and worked for over 20 years as an accomplished humanitarian professional. She has extensive experience in advocating for children's rights, adolescent health and development, public health implications of these issues, and public health in general. She has also quite extensive experience in working on LGBTQ plus rights, volunteerism, and good governance. Her areas of expertise include public policy, public governance, management and operations, program development, media and advocacy, stakeholder engagement, and building partnerships. And without further ado, Ria, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dr. Roman, and to everyone who's here. Good morning, good evening from the Philippines. Okay, so let me start by saying that Filipinos are highly vulnerable to major multisectoral forms of human insecurities, from economic threat to like poverty and unemployment brought about by continuing surge of COVID-19 infections, the food insecurity resulting from inability to access enough food because of insufficient income or lack of income, environmental threat due to air, land, and water pollution and degradation of natural resources, and personal threats like local violence, crime, human trafficking, and displacement of people due to typhoons, earthquakes, and recent terrorism and insurgencies, such as the 2017 Marawi siege, which I think you're all familiar with, which will be the focus of this presentation and the focus of my research. One of the underestimated threats to human security is the implementation of the recent Mandanas-Garcia ruling by our Philippine Supreme Court mandating an equitable share of internal revenue allotment, or the ERA, for the local government units, or what we call the LGUs, nationwide, and the full devolution of certain functions of the national government to LGUs enunciated in the Enabling Act, the Executive Order 138 series of 2021. This means that the increase of that era from 849 billion pesos to 1.3 trillion pesos is expected by 2022. That's roughly $17 billion US dollars. And to mitigate the fiscal impact of transferring the 1 trillion Philippine pesos from the national government to the local government units, pursuant to this ruling, certain functions shall be devolved as provided under Section 17 of Republic Act 7160, or our local government code, to agricultural extension and on-site research, field health and hospital services, community-based forestry projects, public works and infrastructures, tourism facilities promotion and development, housing projects for cities and provinces, telecommunication services, investment support, industrial research and development, school building programs, and social welfare services, which will be the focus of my discussion. So for the outline of the presentation, it's going to be, will be the following: introduction and background of the study, the statement of the problem, the research objectives, the significance of the study, the scope and limitations, summary findings and recommendations, and finally, the references made. Okay. So For the introduction and the background of the study, in 2011, the Department of Social Welfare and Development launched this program, the Sustainable Livelihood Program, to provide livelihood assistance to the poor, primarily for the Conditional Cash Transfer Program, which we call the Pantawid Pamilyang Pilipino program. The goal of this program, the Sustainable Livelihood Program, is to provide a form of social protection to the most disadvantaged and vulnerable members of the society through two tracks. First one, the self-employment or the micro-enterprise, which we provide usually for 15,000 pesos, and for wage employment or the skills training or employment facilitation, which is a 5,000 pesos grant, around $100. The other one is around $300 in US. For the past 6 years, the SLP has benefited a total of 1,103,498 beneficiaries with a total budget of 33.870 billion pesos, or 560 billion dollars, US dollars. Okay, so this policy paper or this research aimed to evaluate the implications of the full devolution of SLP to Marawi City, the local government of Marawi City, because of this Supreme Court ruling which affected it, no, and the executive order. There is yet a study to be conducted in determining the impact of the full devolution of many national programs and projects to the LGU, since the full devolution only started its implementation this year, 2022, which is a critical year for the Philippines because there's a need to understand what is this full devolution all about, and that causes human insecurity, particularly in Marawi City, which was laid to ruins by the Maute militants almost 5 years ago. So for our statement of the problem and the research question, by virtue of the issuance of the EO 138 and its implementing rules and regulations, the institutional capacity and capability of the Marawi City local government to assume effective and efficient implementation of the Sustainable Livelihood Program should be examined in the event of the devolution, which is happening this year. The devolution of the SLP will affect the human security of the 370,000 residents belonging to the 77,170 families displaced by the siege. And another political dissatisfaction may occur if the program will not be successfully implemented. So the study specifically addressed the following question: what is the program assessment of the stakeholders on the implementation of the DSWD's SLP in Marawi City in terms of its REEIS, or the relevance, effectiveness, efficiency, impact, and sustainability? What are the perceptions of our key stakeholders on the devolution of the DSWD's SLP, and if there are any policy recommendations or enhancements for the SLP implementation that must be instituted in order to mitigate the negative implications of the full devolution in terms of human security aspects. So in general, the policy study determined if the SLP in Marawi City is a success by assessing the current design and the implementation according to the human security framework. Furthermore, it identified the opinions of key stakeholders, including the internally displaced persons, the DSWD officials, the local and international NGOs implementing in that area in Marawi City and in Mindanao, and other related government agencies regarding full devolution of the SLP. Most importantly, it proposed policy actions that will address the current and potential deterrents in delivering SLP in Marawi City, with focus on institutional capability and capacity needed by the Marawi City to take full responsibility of the SLP. So so why is this study significant? This will primarily benefit, of course, the Sustainable Livelihood Program beneficiaries of the DSWD, because they will be able to access a relevant, effective, efficient, and sustainable social protection program amidst the ongoing rehabilitation and recovery of the Marawi areas. Note that until now, they have not occupied or they have not gone back No, it has been 5 years already, but these occupants of the Marawi, the area where it was bombed, it's still there. No, during the siege, it's still there. So they're still outside of Marawi, where they are supposed to be going home, or they have not constructed their homes yet. So secondly, it will benefit the DSWD and other national government agencies because the study will provide an in-depth analysis of the current and potential problems in the implementation of SLP. In addition, it will propose strategies for DSWD and the Department of Local Government, as this study about full devolution is novel and its implementation is yet to unfold this year. Note also that all the national government agencies or the executive departments are supposed to submit their devolution transition plan to the Department of Budget and Management so as to calibrate the fundings for the local government units. And the local government units should also have their own DTPs, no? So that there should be a synergized, there will be synergized plans and not duplicate programs and fundings. Thirdly, it will benefit the international development partners like ADB and other international organizations because they will be able to determine what really should be their focus of development interventions, especially on the needs and the priorities of local stakeholders in order to ensure sustainable human security in the context of social protection and individual empowerment in the implementation of what we call the devolution 2.0, since the devolution 1.0, or supposedly the implementation of the local government code of 1991 was not fully realized. So of course, we have scope and limitations. We only focused on Marawi City and the full devolution there with the complexity of what happened in Marawi City and did not take into consideration other areas in the Philippines. And this also involves stakeholders as the TSWD policymakers, implementers, the local and international NGOs, the past and current uniformed personnel assigned during the siege, selected national government agencies that are involved in Marawi City, community representatives, and most importantly, the heavily affected SLP beneficiaries who are all Muslims, no, in this area. So the Sustainable Livelihood Program was measured according to its REIS and other program concerns such as return of investment, the rate of employment, the net income of the beneficiaries, or the personal efficacy of the implementers, and the core processes of the program were not measured or have been evaluated. So in summary, these are the recommendations that I made here in my paper after thoroughly analyzing this study. So given the Marawi siege incident, it is critical for the devolution of the SLP to be successful to prevent another political dissatisfaction arising from ineffective and inefficient service delivery of social welfare and protection programs. I think that will trigger human insecurity and can even result to another revolution, especially that we have so many crises. There's a learning crisis, there's a sugar industry crisis, and added to this, if this is going to escalate, it's going to be another big challenge for the country. So the SLP should focus on the long-term needs of the IDPs, particularly highlighting the attainment of the immediate and long-term needs, including the environmental, socio-cultural, and political needs of the beneficiaries. The study discovered that in terms of the relevance and effectiveness of the program, both implementers and beneficiaries perceived that despite the provisions in Memorandum Circular Number 7, Series of 2019, the cash grants were mostly utilized for the basic and immediate needs rather than the intended livelihood rehabilitation. Hence, there is that failure when it comes to purpose. The beneficiaries themselves admitted that livelihood rehabilitation was not their priority. At the time the program was implemented. Hence, it revealed the shortcoming in DSWD's implementation to consult and involve the IDPs in the program design and decision-making process to make it relevant. The beneficiaries also believe that their human security needs were not addressed well, which even led to the beneficiaries partially agreeing in the effectiveness, efficiency, and impact of the program. So overall, the SLP addressed the short-term needs only of the beneficiaries rather than helping them to be beneficiaries since they are geographically closer and will be directly accountable to their constituents. So finally, let me see. Okay. So these are just the references, but in ending and in closing, with the ruling laid down by the Supreme Court and its enabling act, as I said earlier, the full devolution of the national government programs and functions, including that of the Department of Social Welfare and Development's Sustainable Livelihood Program, and other social protection programs will be transferred to the local government units. And due to the 2017 Marawi siege, it is imperative for this study assessing the human security implications of the full SLP devolution in Marawi City, since the program is supporting the livelihood rehabilitation of internationally displaced persons. So by conducting a perspective survey, key informant interviews, and focus group discussion, this study was able to assess the perceptions of Marawi stakeholders on the current DSWD SLP delivery and on the full devolution to ensure program relevance, effectiveness, efficiency, impact, and sustainability. This study discovered that despite the DSWD addressing only the basic needs of the IDPs rather than rehabilitating their livelihood, which was supposedly the purpose, not to ensure or at least mitigate the risk of human insecurity, the beneficiaries still prefer the SWD or central government to implement the program over the Marawi local government unit because of nepotism practices in the area. While the DSWD officials echo the nepotism concerns of the beneficiaries, most are in favor of the full devolution, arguing that Marawi local government unit will better address the concerns and gaps in the program design and delivery. But again, as I said, there's already the policy that it has to go full devolution, and so there's a policy challenge here, and there's human insecurity that might possibly arise, and this is something that the country must look into seriously, since this is the result of this study. This study has recommended policy enhancements to mitigate the negative implications of the full devolution of the Sustainable Livelihood Program in Marawi City. So with that, thank you very much. And if you have questions, I'd be very much ready to answer them.
Ria, thank you very much. That was a really exciting presentation. We have clearly seen how policy is well drafted, and sometimes execution takes a little bit of time to get done. But I think there were definitely valuable lessons in the area of implementation. Let's just see quickly. I don't see any questions in the chat, and no questions in the QA. But I would like to just ask, maybe besides, there is one question from Anjali Medina. She says, "Hi, Rea. Thanks for the interesting presentation on the Marawi siege. Congrats to the Marawi volunteers led by Sir Tong Pakasum, who was awarded the recognition by the Office of Civil Defense. I've just heard that Dr. Zaf, owner of the Marawi Hospital, I just heard from Dr. Zaf, who is the owner of the Marawi Hospital just a few days ago. Just curious, do you know the status of the healthcare continuity in Marawi? Thank you.
Okay, on the part of if it's a local government unit health devolve project or programs, I believe it would be the local government unit that can answer that. But for what I would know is that for the departments, of the executive departments, there are um, programs which are being placed in the hospitals. That's what we call the malasakit centers. And all of these departments, example, DSWD, DOH, and other departments, they provide support to those who are indigent. So you can just go there. It's like a one-stop shop. So for now, that's what I know. And that for universal health care, we are already piloting it. I mean, the country, the government is already doing that. As for the specifics of Marawi City, the best way to ask really would be the local government unit. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I don't see any other queries or chat comments. So please feel free to engage with Ria further. If you have any questions via email, that information will be provided. Ria, thank you very much. Our next presenter is Professor Meen Chetri, who is the chairperson of the TIEMS review committee and also an officer of the organization. He's actually been a really dedicated officer and worked with the organization for a really extended period of time. He has made substantial contribution, not just to our organization, but also to the disaster and emergency management field worldwide. The title of his presentation will be The Need of Medical Legal Death Investigation Systems to Enhance Response on Management of Death, MOTD. I will do a short introduction and background, and after that I'll hand over to Professor Chetri to take over to proceed with the presentation. Professor Chetri is the president of the Nepal Center for Disaster Management and chairman of the TIEMS Paper Review Committee. He has been appointed in the recent times as adjunct professor at Queensland University of Technology in Brisbane, Australia. This was effective from March 1st, 2009. He's also a faculty member at the Institute for Crisis Management Studies in Kathmandu, Nepal. And in the past, he served as a director of the Department of Disaster Management of the Government of Nepal. This was between 2001 and 2003. From year 2004, he has worked as a deputy regional administrator in Hetaunda, Nepal. And he has also been recognized for his extensive contribution to the field of emergency and disaster management by the AIE Australia Alumni Excellence Award in 2014, and then also with the he was awarded a DPNet Nepal Award in the same year. It gives me great pleasure to hand over to Professor Chetri to share his talk with us today.
Thank you again, Roman, for this comprehensive introduction. And actually, why I chose this subject area is that this is a very important area in disaster management, this management of the dead bodies. And actually, ICRC, International Red Cross Society, is a Red Crescent Society, is going to develop a comprehensive policy for this. And I was one of the consultants between 2019 and 20. So this presentation or this paper is based on that also. So I will try to finish in due time. So before that, I would like to express my sincere thanks to TIEMS family and the organizers of this very important international conference, and particularly to Harold Greger and Roman. This is the content of my presentation. I think it is not necessary to read out all this because I will present this slide by slide. And here is one slide. Actually, this is a very old picture from September 2015. This boy named Alan Kurdi, he died on the way to Europe. With his, he was with his family going to Europe in course of refuge, and the ship was crashed, and the boy died like this. And this was a viral picture, so I just wanted to put it here. And actually, if you see the World Disaster Report 2020, we can find that in the past 10 years, you see 83% of all disasters were actually the natural hazards, particularly the floods, landslides, storms, and heat waves, caused 83%. And now, from 2019 December, we have COVID-19, which shook the whole world, and it has shown that the countries need to work really together because it affected almost all the countries of the world, and even the highly developed countries were also badly affected. So this part also we have to take into account. And I feel the aim of this paper is to inform the policymakers of the respective governments about the background, purpose, structure, function, and outcomes of a modern and effective medical legal death investigation system. And even in highly developed countries, we cannot find a well-structured medical legal investigation system. And the medical legal death investigation system actually is responsible to carry out death investigations and confirming the cause and manner of unnatural, unknown, and unexplained deaths. And there is a right to know about the dead people to their family, because under the international humanitarian law, each and every country must bear the responsibility for preventing disappearances of the dead persons and meeting the needs of their families. And government should also seek to advise from experts and professionals on how to investigate causes of missing people. Because you see, even in 2015, when there was a big earthquake in Nepal, more than 10,000 people died. Still, we have 300-400 dead bodies who are unclaimed, unknown, and they are in the hospital, still in the refrigerator of the hospital. So this kind of situation we should bring to a logical end. And as a background, I would like to say that the medical legal system problems relating to the management of the dead, which are faced by governments around the world, are similar, remarkably similar. Such as what happens is that the wrong body is sometimes released to the family, wrong body, and a body is wrongly identified by the search and rescue personnel, and sometimes two bodies are mixed up together, and wrong body is autopsied or post-mortem, and wrong evidence is provided in a trial or in a public hearing in the court, even in the court. And there is the dispute about post-mortem findings, and the organs are not returned to the body after an autopsy, after the post-mortem. And sometimes the bodies are wrongly labeled, and the samples leading to results attributed to the wrong body. And also there is the problem of disrespectful treatment of a body, because sometimes there are people who are not well trained, and they just mishandle the dead bodies. And that is the problem in big disasters. And the quality of a death investigation system is actually difficult to evaluate. However, it can be measured with some indicators. We can develop some indicators and solve the problem. Because there are technical aspects to solve this kind of solutions, and there are medical legal system issues that needs to be addressed to properly respond, and therefore when people die during wars or disasters or in course of migration, their bodies must be handled respectfully and with dignity. That is the human right of the dead person as well as his or her family, friends, or relatives. That is what we have to keep into mind. And the remains of unknown individuals must be searched for, recovered, and identified properly. Because human beings have the right not to lose their identities even after the death. And that this is also mentioned in the Declaration of Human Rights developed by the United Nations in 1948. Therefore, it is very clear that there is a substantial public need for accurate death information, and humanitarian work has come to include these tasks for which forensic science actually offers matchless tools and expertise. We have the human resources as well as tools and expertise. The only need is that the respective governments should pay due attention towards this aspect and develop the necessary infrastructure. And one particularly compelling need is for information about the cause and manner of death for criminal justice. Moreover, ensuring the security of the remains facilitates proper identifications of the remains, maintains a proper chain of custody, and safeguards property and evidence. Therefore, humanitarian efforts by the concerned governments are required to include these tasks for which forensic science offers matchless tools, expertise, and techniques, which I already mentioned earlier. So, this I just wanted to tell you as a background. And actually, the context is that the death of a loved one leaves a permanent mark on the survivors because the dead person is dead, but his friends, relatives, nearer or dearer ones will have the lifelong trauma. So, this happens because of the lack of the information and various other things which I already mentioned earlier. Therefore, when people die during wars or disasters or due to some unnatural causes, their bodies must be handled respectfully and with dignity. And their remains, I think, as far as possible, must be searched, recovered, and identified. Sometimes it is not possible. If the body is totally burned out, then I think we cannot help in that case. So this is the thing we have to take into account. However, the humanitarian effort is to include these tasks for which forensic science offers perfect tools and expertise and techniques. Again, I would like to repeat that the only need is that the concerned governments, the respective governments, must develop the infrastructure and should bring together this kind of expertise and techniques and do the needful. And also, we have to take into account that if data is missing, then we should know that the person is missing. So, data and information also are very important in such events. And the solution also must be sought for which biometric data and forensic science can be highly useful, or we can use them. And actually, the death does not end human suffering, especially when death is sudden as the result of a disaster. It can happen in any, as I mentioned, in the disaster or in the crisis situation or during the migration and in natural disasters also it happens. And actually, you see, if there is a huge landslide and the dead body is buried below the earth, maybe hundreds of meters below, then we are helpless. We cannot recover. We cannot find out the dead body. In that case, nobody can help. And that is the exceptional case. But in other cases, also, the point is that we should not ignore the fact. Therefore, during the disaster response, dead body management is a key element. And how dead bodies are dealt with can have an intense impact and long-lasting effect on the mental health of survivors, of their relatives, friends, and nearer and dearer ones, and also communities. Their proper management is a core component of disaster response. And at the disaster site, dealing with the dead is the responsibility of the first responder, which latter is the accountability of the disaster manager or incident commander in huge disasters. So what we have to do then is that we have to facilitate for rapid cremations and the use of bulldozers to rapid cremations and the use of bulldozers to gather the dead bodies and the lack of the place in which to bury a corpse can cause a lot of stress to the relatives of the survivors. So this kind of things, rapid cremations, use of bulldozers and hassle should not be done. Therefore, this ICRC advises that the cremation of unidentified bodies should be avoided unless and until their relatives are present there, and if they claim the body and if they are happy and the dead body is handled with dignity, then there is no problem. Then what we have to do, what the disaster responder must do is that the disaster manager or incident commander who are on the site must manage public information and messages, and should collaborate with key agencies like police, army, civil defense organization, public prosecutor, coroner, and so on and so forth. And it is also very important that the dead and their relatives or family members and friends must be respected at all times. If they have some question or concern or worries, then we should try to address their concern. And if it is possible, religious and cultural requirements should be observed, and normal procedures for mourning and burial should be allowed, because sometimes people are ignored and the responders, they are under pressure and they have to handle hundreds of dead bodies. Then it may not be possible, but as far as possible, these religious and cultural requirements also should be fulfilled. And appropriate planning for the disposal of dead bodies and adoption of best practices in handling dead bodies is also highly desirable. These are the things we should take into account. Actually, this picture is from the Typhoon Haiyan in the Philippines in 2013. Here in that city, that typhoon killed more than 10,000 people on the spot. The whole city was destroyed. And the responders, the disaster managers, they did like this. You see, they dig one big trench like this, and they buried all the dead bodies like this, which is not appropriate, which ought not to do. So maybe they had the problem, but I think this is not an appropriate way. That is what I meant to say here. More importantly, actually, I briefly mentioned earlier also, we have to take into account, we have to consider the right of the dead. Even if the person is dead, he has the right, and his family members have the right for dignified handling of the dead body, because human beings, as we can see here, human beings have the right not to lose their identity even after the death. So for this, a reliable death investigation system is essential to a properly functioning justice system, which in turn underpins a safe and fair society. Undignified or improper burials is naturally unacceptable to the friends and families of the dead, and even to the community also. So therefore, priority should be given to people to recreate social networks, to avoid isolation, and to give people an appropriate opportunity to mourn. We have to allow them. And religious and community leaders can play a vital role in helping relatives to better understand and accept the recovery and management of dead bodies. Because during the time of huge disasters, the first responders, there may be the misunderstanding, confusion, and even sometimes you see hot discussions between the first responders and the family members of the dead people. So these are the things we have to take into account. We have to try to solve the problem. I will very briefly mention about the problems of this management of the dead bodies. Because actually the problems are as following. Most countries do not have an extensive leadership or management system in running a medical legal system. As I mentioned earlier, that some countries, they don't have well structured and well developed infrastructure and this expertise. So that is why a medical legal system which would enable more experience-based advice must be provided. And also another problem is that in some countries, there is no easily available and appropriate literature covering the leadership or management of the medical legal system governing its operation. And this medical legal system is is seriously ignored by some governments. And I told you earlier that even in highly developed countries also they have some problem. Therefore, forensic sciences are often not empowered. There is usually no expertise within the wider government bureaucracy relating to the medical legal system. Even if they have, they are working somewhere else. You see, they don't work for the management of the dead bodies, MOTD. And that is the problem, because people think that even the government thinks that dead is dead. Why we have to waste time, money, and resources for a dead body, which is very wrong. So there is a shortage of skilled personnel. Even if there is, they are being appointed, they are being seconded somewhere else. They are doing some other jobs, not this medical legal system. And this problem is actually very serious due to the inadequate funds and resources by the respective governments. Our objective actually must be for the public interest to ensure that defined deaths are subject to independent and accountable investigation and judicial review to support criminal and civil justice. And the government should try to determine who has died, why he died, he or she died, and how the death occurred. These are the important things after death we have to see. And we have to determine if further action should be taken in relation to the death. And we have to use information derived from the investigation to try and prevent other death and injuries. And we have to support families, friends, and others directly affected by these deaths. And more importantly, again, dignified handling of the dead is a very important thing. And why these kinds of problems are there is that we have not been able to pay due attention towards this aspect. So the problems and main issues are the same, and there are the problem of structural and non-structural capability for the management of the dead in various countries. And it depends and it varies country by country. In some countries it is okay, in some countries it is far below, and like that. And actually structural measures are physical construction, as I mentioned earlier, and non-structural measures are measures not involving physical construction, which use knowledge, practice, or agreement to reduce disaster risks and impacts, in particular through policies and laws, public awareness raising, training, and education. Problems I have already mentioned. And actually the person in authority who are on site of the disasters, they have to protect the dead body, they have to search the missing persons, and the body recovery tasks must be done rapidly but appropriately to correctly identify the dead and reduce the mental tension of the survivors. Survivor means the family members and relatives and friends. The first responders and the disaster commander or manager should create an environment where the dead bodies are treated in dignified manner and ensure and respect the human right of the dead. I already mentioned earlier also, and it is mentioned in the Declaration of Human Rights in 1948 by United Nations. And We have to build an infrastructure that is well equipped with well-developed forensic medical legal death investigation response and management of the dead system. So this is a diagram for an efficient management of the dead bodies. There should be training, research, services, teaching, and capacity building. These are the components of an efficient management of the dead body. And who should be involved? You see, there is no time to explain all this, but I will briefly mention that, like all these professionals and personnel needs to be involved for the efficient management of the deaths. Like who means forensic pathologist, doctors, medical examiner, coroner, police prosecutor, judge, and authorized persons, police and coroner means prosecutor, and forensic specialists and like this. So all these people and professionals must be involved for the efficient management of the dead bodies. So here I have some recommendations how we can make it more efficient and effective is to create an effective and efficient medical legal death investigation system. Response and management of the death system is necessary, and there should be the justice on human dignity even after the death through the pursuit of environmental conservation, human development, and sustainable way. And we have to make competent and accountable all the concerned stakeholders, as we have seen that so many agencies and professionals must be involved for the identification of the dead bodies, like police, prosecutor, judge, and forensic scientists, and doctors, and so on and so forth, nurses, of course. And data and information is always very necessary for the institutions responsible for the management of the dead to develop their own policy, which includes the key elements to properly respond in emergencies. And they have to identify main elements and obtain ways and means for developing policies and strategies on management of the dead, and provide guidelines and priorities to formulate a strategy and a plan of action for management of the dead during emergencies, and identify the constraints, challenges, and opportunities in the management of the dead during emergencies, and promote cooperation among institutions at all levels with the working groups and representatives involved in disaster management. This is the brief presentation. Actually, this is a vast area, and ICRC has developed, I think they have not yet published, but they have developed an international policy for the respective governments, management of the dead. In conclusion, I would just like to say that the medical legal death investigation system must be in the public interest, and because to ensure that defined deaths are subject to independent and accountable investigation and judicial review to underpin criminal and civil justice. That is very important. And the absence of necessary policy is particularly challenging in various countries in relation to the management of the dead, particularly in the time of conflict and disasters. And if these issues are not addressed through a proactive policy, it will be difficult to manage disasters. Therefore, effective and proactive legal tools are highly desirable to ensure a dignified and proper management of the dead. And in the end, I would just like to show you one slide that is about the policy. That is, you see, this is my final note. Good policy with bad implementation is bad policy. Even if we have a good policy, if it is not implemented properly, then it will become a bad policy. So the governments, the people who are implementing the policy must know this fact. Okay, thank you very much. That's all.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I mean, that was very insightful. We will, I have collated the questions that were put into the chat and into the QA box, and we're going to pass them on to Prof. Chetri, and we will request, if possible, if you can answer via email. Thank you very much one more time. We will move along with the program. The next speaker is Professor Casey Rondello from Adelphi University in Garden City, New York. We will have two presentations from this speaker. Professor Rondello holds a Bachelor of Arts in Journalism and Business Administration, originally from Trinity University in the United States, which was followed by a Master of Public Health in Health Policy Resources and Administration from the Yale School of Medicine, and then doctorate or MD in Epidemiology and Public Health from St. George's Medical School in the United Kingdom. Professor Rondello is currently holds the position of Clinical Associate Professor in the Public Health Program in the College of Nursing and Public Health at Adelphi University in New York. And he teaches courses which are focused on application of human disease to public health practice. He also teaches courses in health management in the time of disaster and the policy aspects of healthcare and public health. Research interests of Professor Rondello's include epidemiology in disasters and alternative medical treatment sites and points of distribution of dispensing. Without further ado, I would like to then transfer the word to Professor Rondello, and his first talk will be Just the Facts, ma'am, work of disease detectives in a public health crisis and how you can help. Prof, the floor is yours.
Well, I appreciate your introduction, Roman, and it was a pleasure to follow Dr. Meen Chetri. In 2013, I actually traveled to Kathmandu to serve as a consultant to Nobel Medical College and the Ministry of Health and Population in earthquake mitigation and medical disaster preparedness. And I have very fond memories of that time, met many wonderful colleagues. And so Nepal is very near to my heart. So I found the talk quite interesting. It's an honor to join the other esteemed presenters from around the globe in speaking at this year's International Emergency Management Society Conference. And I'm very pleased to be presenting at this, very rewarding and meaningful symposium. Before I get underway, I do want to extend my thanks to Marilyn Tamayo and Roman Tanlik, who have been my liaisons with the conference. And I tell you how much I appreciate your guidance and assistance in making the arrangements for me to present. And also, of course, to extend my, I know we all appreciate the contributions of K. Harold Drager in providing leadership and direction, not just to the International Emergency Management Society, but to the discipline that we are all so incredibly devoted to. So thank you for the invitation. I'm going to take a moment to switch over my screen, and then I'll get my presentation underway. I'll do my best to keep within the time frame. I know we're running a bit behind. If we don't have time for questions and comments to follow, then as it was done with the previous speaker, I'm very happy to entertain those after the fact. You know a bit about what I do from the introduction that Roman gave. I am a physician with a medical specialty in disaster epidemiology. I wear a number of hats. I serve as the university epidemiologist for Adelphi University in New York, where I'm also a professor, been there for about 20 years. But I also serve as a disaster epidemiologist with the U.S. National Disaster Medical Systems Emergency Medical Response Arm. So in the U.S., this section, the NDMS, National Disaster Medical System of the Department of Health and Human Services, is responsible for managing the federal government's medical response to major emergencies and disasters. This includes natural disasters and technological disasters that occur in peacetime in the civilian world, but also we provide support for armed conflicts that occur overseas. Partners to the NDMS include the Federal Emergency Management Agency, which you're all very familiar with, I'm sure, FEMA, but also the Department of Defense and the Department of Veterans Affairs. So the NDMS's primary missions are threefold. Number one, in a crisis, to provide emergency medical care, particularly in regions of the country that have been overwhelmed by disaster. And as a consequence, they are unable to function the way they normally would. In addition to that, we provide patient transportation to the third of our objectives, which is definitive medical care, which typically takes place in partner hospitals that are part of the NDMS system. So from the time that a patient is affected initially, it's providing the emergency medical care, providing them transportation to usually a tertiary care center, and then getting them that definitive care that'll bring them back to, hopefully, to full wellness. There are a number of NDMS teams that are part of this whole operation. The disaster medical assistance teams, or DMATs, make up the bulk. But there's also the National Medical Response Team. There's a disaster mortuary team in line with the last presentation, a National Veterinary Response Team, and an International Medical Surgical Response Team. I'm part of what's called the MSET. I know we love our alphabet soup, but the Multi-Specialty Enhancement Team for specialists, as I'm a disaster epidemiologist. Now, in most cases, when a disaster strikes an area, the capacity of the existing medical facilities, be they doctors' offices, clinics, hospitals, will become quickly overrun. And as a consequence, it will be essential for a region to stand up and operationalize what are called alternate medical treatment sites, places that don't normally render medical care, but you have set them up to do so, whether it be in a library or a school or a gymnasium. You're taking a space that had some other purpose, and you are often in very short order converting it, retrofitting it into a place where you can deliver medical care out of. Those in emergency management are very often tasked with doing this, with setting up these facilities, when a crisis has happened. And the emergency management folks, don't often think of the myriad of issues that need to be considered when selecting and operationalizing an alternate medical treatment site. So the purpose of this talk, as best as I can, in the 15 minutes that remain, is give you a snapshot of the major types of issues you're going to confront when standing up an alternate medical treatment site. I've divided these issues into 4 buckets: the logistical issues, the clinical issues, the administrative issues, and then just sort of miscellaneous challenges, a list of challenges and pitfalls. Like I said, this is, a much deeper conversation than 20 minutes will typically allow. But I'll do my best to at least give you a taste, a flavor of the sorts of considerations that you need to make and the kinds of decisions that you'll need to confront and address if you are charged with assisting in the creation of alternate medical treatment sites, which in most disasters of any sizable of any large size, you're certainly going to have to do. So the first category I'd like to talk about are the logistical issues, and there are many. Probably the first major logistical issue that folks do think of is size. Do we have a place that is big enough for what we're trying to do? And, that is absolutely a major consideration. But as you'll see by the end of this talk, it's just one of many, many considerations that you need to make. But certainly you start off by saying, okay, this particular location that we have identified, does it have adequate size for the clinical treatment that we will be conducting, size for administrative areas, for people to be managing and, for paperwork and all of the administrative functions that come with running an alternate medical treatment site. Does the size include enough space for supply? Some of that supply will need to be secured. It could be something like a vaccine that is very highly sought after, or medications that are potentially life-saving. And so you can't just have those in sort of an open room, expecting that they're going to remain secure. So having not just supply areas, but some areas that can be guarded and secured to ensure that what you have there stays safe. Is there enough space for the nutrition, hydration, and sleeping for the folks that will be working in the alternate medical treatment site? What about setting aside sufficient space for quiet? mental health area where folks can disconnect from the disaster and spend some time, mentally decompressing away from the heavy duty areas of treatment. And then, of course, there's, the media and politicians and others that will be coming, and you certainly don't want them parading through the clinical space. So does your size of the space have enough room where you can corral information folks? So your public information officer and others can communicate with the media and the outside world, but not in a way that's going to be disruptive to the medical care that you're delivering. So all of that and more falls into the bucket of size. Also, when you're looking at a site, logistical issue includes security and safety, which I spoke about a little bit of. But let's just talk first about safety. You are setting this up because of some crisis that has occurred. It might be a natural disaster like a hurricane or a typhoon. So given that, is the site that you are standing up, does it have the structural integrity to withstand whatever disaster it is that you're setting this up in the first place to respond to? So ensuring that it is a structurally safe place that will provide protection for not just the individuals within it, staff and patients, but also for the stockpile and the medical material that's there. Have you considered issues of fire suppression, emergency exits, evacuation routes, and how you would handle behavioral issues that you might confront as it relates to security and safety? Then utility support. Usually the space that you're going to be taking over it's certainly not built for the purpose that you are now going to be conducting there. So if it is a warehouse, I'm thinking of examples in my history of places that we've gone to, a gymnasium, a vacant supermarket that was closed down years earlier and the shelves have been ripped out, and so basically a big open space. Does it have the utility support for having hundreds of people in this building? Is there sufficient electricity, sufficient potable water and non-potable water for sanitation? What about climate control? Heating and air conditioning may need to be brought in supplemental, given the number of bodies that are going to be in this facility. Communications, we all know, is a huge issue in emergency management that is, we can never have enough of, nor enough types of. So having communications and redundancy of communications for when some of those methods inevitably fail. All of that needs to be considered under utility support. Location, finding a place that is familiar to the population. If you choose a stadium or a college campus, chances are very good that folks already know how to get there. And so, spreading out the message of medical aid is available in this site is a lot easier for people to find and get to if they know the space, as opposed to a random warehouse in an industrial park where, people are going to get lost. They're not going to know, instinctively how to find the facility. So familiarity to location, familiarity to the population. Does it have the various types of physical access? So multiple staircases, elevators, ramps, etc. What about parking? A lot of times the alternate medical treatment sites are in places where you can't have a lot of parking. And if that's the case, you need to consider, how are we going to have people park off-site and have a shuttle bus that takes people back and forth to the AMTS? However you address it, you need to think about parking. You also want, ideally, a location that can be accessed from multiple roads, multiple major highways, multiple routes, so that if one is incapacitated due to flooding or due to heavy traffic or something that makes that mode of entry either difficult or impossible, there are other major routes of access that will get people to that facility. And then I also, ideally, in terms of transportation, are there other ways aside from car travel that folks can get there? Bus lines, rail transit. How do you expect folks to get back and forth to this facility? That's all part of your selection of location. For medical material, where are you going to get the medications and the medical equipment to operate this facility? Perhaps your municipality has a disaster stockpile, be it federal or regional or local. But in the United States, we have the SNS, the Strategic National Stockpile, which is governed by the federal government. But these are strategically located warehouses across the country that can be tapped into, for supply when we confront a situation like this. But where are you going to get this medical material and medication? Perhaps from the local pharmacies, perhaps from the local hospitals, but have a plan for that. Waste management and sanitation. There'll be different types of waste, infectious and non-infectious, and they need to be addressed separately. How are you going to handle human excreta, toileting facilities for a large number of people in this facility, bathing facilities, laundering facilities for not just clothing, but for the linens that you'll be washing, from the patient care areas and so on. And then, of course, fatality management. You can't help but have an area dedicated to that. It's important that it be removed from clinical care areas, that if the remains are going to be stored for a longer period of time, that you consider some form of refrigeration. We have disaster medical trucks that come in for long-term storage of remains. And then consider that you might also be dealing with an issue of homeland security. If it was a terrorism incident, there's likely to be law enforcement involvement. And so you need to be able to accommodate their needs as best as you can while you're rendering medical aid for folks. So all of that falls into the bucket of logistical issues. There are many, and they are among those that need to be considered. Then there are the clinical issues. So right off the bat, infection control. When you go into a hospital or a clinic, you take it for granted that the air conditioning system is likely HEPA filtrated to minimize the distribution of airborne particles. Surfaces like the floor and the chairs and the beds are purposefully designed not to absorb body fluids so that they can easily decontaminated with the proper, sterilization and disinfection solutions, right? But if you're going to go to a library or a school, you may be dealing with carpet. You may be dealing with fabric seats. These are surfaces that are not very good for infection control. So how are you going to handle infection control in that environment? What sorts of antimicrobials are you going to use? What personal protective equipment will you have for those that are working there? How are you handling air filtration, even if it's bringing in portable HEPA filtration filters for a room? That's infection control. Then there's patient flow. So that's basically human traffic. I've found that when you have a lot of patients that are going through an AMTS from start to finish, it can be very confusing, and let's lay it out in a very logical, sequential way in which they know that you go from A to B to C to D and out the door. You are setting this up so that patient flow is unidirectional. People are entering one place and they're coming out another. Patients are never doubling back and exiting the place they came in. You can facilitate the patient flow with signage that is thoughtfully placed, and also with people whose jobs it is to prompt patient flow. We call those flow controllers. Think of them as, the folks on a tarmac on an airport that have the lighted sticks that guide airplanes in. Think of flow controllers as doing the same thing, but for human traffic. And their job is to simply facilitate moving people through the various steps to get to register, get the care they need, get instructions for follow-up care, and then get out the door. So how are you going to handle patient flow throughout the complex? Record keeping is never going to be as substantial as it would be in a non-disaster situation, but you're still going to need to do some record keeping in order to document who you saw, what their problem was, and what you did for them. So even if you do nothing more than that, you need some ability to track folks down after the fact if you need to reach out to them. And you also have to have some documentation for those like myself in the epidemiology world who are trying to take a look at the big picture and solve this problem in the aggregate. Are you going to do that record keeping using electronic means like iPads and tablets, or do situations call for paper to be used in record keeping? Like I said, for many purposes, epidemiologic included. And then clinically, this is obviously going to put enormous stress on not just the patients, but on the individuals who are working at the alternate medical treatment site. And so what accommodations have you been made to help ensure the best possible mental health for staff and for patients. You do that by assigning individuals whose sole role is to monitor mental health and to provide even rapid treatment for folks that are struggling. Those are all clinical issues. Administrative issues include personnel. That's where you're going to get the people to run these facilities because they're likely already in hospitals and doctors' offices. And so the availability of clinical and non-clinical folks is going to be really dramatically tapped. So where are people going to come from? What are going to be your policies for operations? Ideally, they'll be the same going from AMTS to AMTS so that if individuals work in one day and then get transferred to another, if the policies are consistent, they will have a lot easier time making that transition. And then, as I mentioned on an earlier slide, how are you going to handle nutrition, hydration, and sleeping for those that are going to be staffing the facility? That's, provision of food, provision of bedding, provision of potable water, and having, of course, the space to do all of that. And finally, the challenges and pitfalls. And there's really no way for me to encapsulate all of this on one slide, but I'm just trying to give you a taste of, some of the challenges you're going to face that you need to think through before you decide on a location as an alternate medical treatment site and start setting it up. What about special needs patients? Now, special needs can be a number of different things. We typically think of those who are non-ambulatory or have limited mobility, but special needs patients also include those that have sensory defects, like have difficulty hearing or difficulty seeing, those that have language barriers and speak a language other than the primary language of the AMTS. You can have the best signage in the world, but if it's in a language that some of the patients don't understand, it's not going to do you any help. How are you going to address those special needs patients? Special patients can also be those that are pregnant, those that cannot read, those that have dependents with them. How are you going to treat a mother who comes in trailing with 3 healthy, but, children that need to be addressed while you are treating the mother? So all of that falls into special needs patients. There are political issues because the folks running this AMTS are not the ones making the decisions on money and people and security. Most often, those folks are politicians. So regular communication with the key decision makers is vital. It's important that when you're speaking to decision makers that you use lay terms and not medical terms or emergency management terms. We may understand our vernacular, that we may understand, emergency operations centers and, the various, all the kinds of lingo that we talk, but they will not. So distilling information down for the decision makers is essential, and putting it in a language that they understand is also important. That may be, instead of giving them a written report, charts, graphs, maps, things that are graphic, whatever you need to do to communicate appropriately to the key politicians and decision makers. Consider adverse environmental conditions. These are you're setting this up because of a disaster. So how's that disaster going to affect road, rail, and airport closures? How's that disaster going to affect utility outages like power going down, flooded facilities that back up sewer lines, communications failures that interrupt your internet capability? All of that, needs to be thought through. Public relations, I mentioned that earlier. They're going to be a part of your situation, whether you like it or not. So manage them before they manage you is my best advice. That means creating a specific briefing area for public relations, having a single individual, a PIO, serve as the sole source of information for them, and providing regular, scheduled, frequent updates, even if there's not a whole lot of new news, just to ensure that that line of communication remains open. Compliance, you want people to come there, so use the media to help communicate your message, communicate honestly and with a multi-pronged approach. So in other words, that means internet, paper, whatever way you can get your message out in multiple ways. And finally, timeline. You're always going to have less time than you want to set up an alternate medical treatment site. So do what you can in advance before the disaster strikes to identify and inspect potential locations that might be viable. You can do that now. you can learn about its utility and infrastructure sources and whether they are going to be vulnerable weak links in the chain. You can do drilling and tabletop exercises and pre-training, and even set up a MOS alternate medical treatment site now to nail down any potential problems that might occur, down the road when you have the disaster. So again, this was just a snapshot of alternate medical treatment sites and a quick list of issues. Like I said, we won't have time for questions here because I'm going to be transitioning to our next presentation. But if you do have any questions for me, I'm always happy to entertain them. This is my contact information. It's very easy. It's just my last name at my university. So rondello@adelphi.edu. And so that's it for this presentation. If you give me 30 seconds here, I'm going to upload my new one and then we'll swap over. All right, folks. My second presentation is a little more what I do on a day-to-day basis. And that's Just the Facts, Ma'am, the work of disease detectives in a public health crisis and how you can help. So as was mentioned by Roman and then myself, I am a disaster epidemiologist. Epidemiologists are public health physicians, and there are not many of us who specialize in disaster conditions. And that's what I am, disaster epidemiologist. When I say that to people, I often get a very quizzical look. They're not really sure what that means. And so just to ensure that we are all speaking the same language and on the same playing field, I'll start off by defining precisely what I mean when I say disaster and exactly what I mean when I say epidemiologist, disaster epidemiologist. So if you look at 10 sources and look to definitions of what a disaster is, you're going to get 10 different definitions that are really going to reflect the bias of the author of your source. Because, when you think about disasters, they really cover the complete spectrum. And so people are going to define that differently. For our purposes, I'm going to use this definition. And we're going to say, it's a very broad definition. We'll say a disaster is any situation or event that overwhelms local capacity. So in other words, the area affected cannot handle this situation on its own. And so as a consequence, the area needs external assistance, be that from another state, another country, another municipality, another county, another whatever it is, in the country where you live. But you're going outside for aid because of this situation that has occurred. That's really the critical piece of what makes a disaster. It can be slow onset, but it is more often unforeseen and a sudden onset event that causes great damage, destruction, and or human suffering. When I ask my students what's a disaster, the first answer I get is it's an event that that occurs that claims a lot of lives. And while a situation like that would be considered a disaster, that's an incomplete definition because there's plenty of disasters that don't result in a great deal of mortality, or maybe not even a great deal of morbidity, people getting sick or hurt. But instead, there's great societal disruption or infrastructure damage or massive damage to the environment, right? All of those things can constitute disasters, great damage, destruction, and or human suffering. We can divide disasters into two buckets, those that are natural disasters and those that are anthropogenic or human-caused disasters. Geophysical, we're talking about earthquakes and volcanoes. Hydrological, you're talking about storm surges and tides. Climatological, you're talking about major storms. Meteorological, heat waves. Biological, things like emerging infections. We've all, I used to have to explain to students what an emerging infection was. Unfortunately, now that we have all experienced the COVID crisis for the last almost 3 years now, and as you might imagine, as a disaster epidemiologist, that's been basically my whole life for 3 years. I no longer have to explain what an emerging infection biological crisis looks like. So all those various types of disasters that you're thinking of there are, naturally caused fall into the natural disaster bucket. And then there are those that are anthropogenic or technological, and they can be divided into those that are unintentional. Think oil spills or hazmat incidents in a factory, things that happen, in industry accidentally or intentional. And when you're talking about intentional anthropogenic, there's really only one cause of that, and that's an act of terrorism. So something has occurred, and the disaster is as a result of an intentional human act. All right, so that all of that helps us wrap our heads around what is a disaster. So if I'm a disaster epidemiologist, what is the epidemiologist part of that? Well, epidemiology is the science of public health. It is a quantitative study, which means that it is data-driven and numbers-based, okay? Epidemiology relies on the analysis of data, numeric data. Okay, so it's a quantitative study of the distribution and determinants of health-related events in human populations. That's what epidemiology is. So you're looking at the distribution of who has gotten sick or hurt. So that's descriptive epidemiology. And then analytic epidemiology is answering the why and the how. How did those people become ill? Why are they ill? That's the determinants of disease. So that's epidemiology, the quantitative study of the distribution and determinants of health-related events in human populations. Disaster epidemiology is applying that science in a disaster. That's all disaster epidemiology is. That would be interesting and academic, but ultimately anecdotal and not very helpful, except for the fact that we know that adverse health outcomes occur in predictable patterns. And because of that, disaster epidemiology is a critical science in emergency management. If health outcomes following a disaster were random, then disaster epidemiology wouldn't be of much help. But history has shown that adverse health outcomes occur in predictable patterns. And so it gives us a roadmap to understanding the distribution and determinants of health-related events when a crisis occurs. It allows us, even before the storm hits, or even before the building comes down, to assess the long-term and short-term adverse health effects and predict and prevent the consequences of future disasters. It allows us to be a little bit of a Nostradamus and to look ahead and know what we're going to confront when a disaster of a certain type occurs. We will never be able to eliminate these disasters from happening. That's outside of our control. And you know as well as I do that it appears that both the magnitude and the number of these disasters, the natural ones, are increasing with time. We will not be able to stop that. We can mitigate those disasters' consequences. And that's really where the money is here, right? That's really where the bulk of the value is here. It's not that we are going to prevent disasters from occurring. It's that by our actions, we are going to mitigate their consequences so that they result in less mortality, less death, less morbidity, that's people who are sick or hurt, and less disruption in our lives. In emergency management lingo, what we do as disaster epidemiologists is provide to emergency managers situational awareness, giving them the information of what the needs of this disaster are, often before the disaster has even struck, help them to plan their response, and then when the crisis happens, gather the appropriate resources and deploy them where they're going to do the most good for the most amount of people. Disaster epidemiologists have roles before, during, and after a disaster. Before a disaster even occurs, disaster epidemiologists are figuring out what populations are most vulnerable for a given type of hazard. So if we're talking about a flood, beforehand, in the non-disaster phase, disaster epidemiologists will be conducting vulnerability analyses to determine what people, property, and environment are most vulnerable to a possible flood in this area. Okay, so we're doing that sort of analysis ahead of time. We're assessing an area's level of emergency preparedness. We gather lots of data in epidemiology. And so we get that data sometimes from existing surveillance systems that are already out there. hospital records, ambulance run sheets, and so on, or records that, are always being kept, not just during a disaster. And so we're figuring out what data is out there now and how can we tap that for our use in a crisis. What's the flexibility of existing surveillance systems so that we don't have to create ones from whole cloth when the disaster strikes? We're conducting education of at-risk populations. So when we do that vulnerability analysis, we determine that this cluster of homes is most vulnerable to a riverine flood. If there's a storm, then we're educating that population to inform them of such and help them to make appropriate arrangements before the disaster strikes. And then, of course, we're training the health and safety personnel on how best to respond to a disaster when it occurs. All of that is before a disaster happens. Then a disaster happens, and epidemiologists' role shifts to doing this. We are among the first people with boots on the ground conducting a proper damage assessment, determining what has happened and what patterns we are beginning to see in morbidity and mortality. Then we are matching the available resources to the population's most urgent needs to ensure that people, medical material, medications, assistance of all types gets to where it's needed most at the time. Okay. Remember from the previous lecture, we're coordinating the decisions between those that are in the clinical world and those in the political world who are actually the ones who pull the trigger and make decisions on road closures or make decisions on issuing a boil water order for the potable water supply and so on. And we are able to, because of our experience dealing with historical disasters and scientific analysis, we are able to advise emergency managers and others on what the probable health effects they are going to see from a disaster of this type, even before we start gathering data from this specific disaster. Then after the disaster, just like all emergency managers, we're conducting a retrospective analysis. We're looking back and doing, what lessons have we learned? Why did some survive and others die? What information can we learn from this to help mitigate a future disaster? We're helping to get long-term reconstruction rehabilitation services back online so that we are restoring the community back to or better than its pre-disaster condition. Okay. And finally, for the last bit of talk during this presentation, I just want to introduce you to a few epidemiologists' tools and just give you a little, as I said earlier, taste of how we do our science. So, I used to give a lecture like this before COVID, and a lot of this was completely new to people. But because of the pandemic, things like epidemic curves are something that even lay people are beginning to understand. So an epidemic curve is a bread and butter tool that epidemiologists use as a starting point to investigate an outbreak of an infectious disease. These epidemic curves evolve over time, and they show us how the outbreak is changing over days, weeks, months. As you can see, they're pretty simple. On the x-axis, you have some function of time, days, weeks, months, years. And then on the y-axis, you have the number of people sick or the percentage affected or, cases per day and so on. Epidemic curves provide a continuous ongoing assessment of the disaster condition. And from COVID that we very carefully read the epidemic curves like a guidepost to help inform us where we are in this situation. Is it getting better? Is it getting worse? And we get clues from the epidemic curves. So epidemic curves can tell us a number of things. They can tell us how big the outbreak is, what its magnitude is, right? How many people are sick? The trend of the outbreak. Are we seeing that this is getting better or worse? Are we seeing patterns that are undulating? Have we reached a plateau? Did we reach the highest point of this crisis yet? Is there a pattern to the curve that we see? Okay. And by deciphering that pattern, we may be able to tell how a given disease is spreading. My final slide, I'll show you, gives you an example of that. And then it gives you an epidemic curve, gives you an idea of the period of exposure. When did this begin? When was the last case reported? And track that over the period of time. So this is some of the clues that we can analyze when we're looking at epidemic curves. Here are 3 examples of different epidemic curves. And they give insight to epidemiologists of how the disease is being spread. And this is my final slide. The modes of spread. So the first one, this is an example of what's called a point source epidemic. You'll see here that they had a rapid rise and then a less rapid fall, but then everybody basically got sick around the same time, and then gradually folks recovered over some period of time. This is called a point source epidemic, and it's exactly what it sounds like. It means that everyone was exposed at one point in time. The quintessential example of a point source epidemic would be the spoiled potato salad at a church picnic, right? So it's a Saturday, the potato salad is left out for too long. Everyone's kind of eating it within a few hours. Everybody's kind of getting sick around the same time, and then they're all recovering over a series of days that follow. That's a point source epidemic. A continuous common source epidemic, you'll notice that the cases more gradually increase. There's usually a plateau, and then there's a much more protracted recovery when there's fewer and fewer cases. So it's a really flattened bell curve. An example of this would be something like a poisoned well. So people are getting access to the water in that well over a period of days or weeks or months, and they're getting sick in a time frame that's according to that exposure. And then they're getting better over a more protracted time period. So when you see this kind of a big, low, squished hump, that's a continuous common source epidemic, and you're looking for something that people are getting exposed to over a long period of time. And finally, a propagated outbreak epidemic curve. Here you see a very different pattern. Here you see it goes up and down, up and down, up and down. Okay, this is exactly what we saw, and to some extent still are seeing with COVID. These represent waves of infection, often correlating with the infectious period or the incubation period of a given pathogen. And in a propagated outbreak type epidemic, you're looking for an infectious disease that's spreading from person to person. There is no common source. They're not going to the potato salad. They're not accessing the well over a period of days, weeks, and months. Instead, you're getting a load of people that get sick and then recover, but they expose the next load and then they recover, and so on. And you'll see that waves of infection occurring. Again, it's what we saw with COVID. So that's just a little, hopefully gives you a little bit of an understanding of the role that epidemiologists play, disaster epidemiologists in a crisis. Again, for the sake of time, and I know the conference is running late, I'm going to wrap up here and not entertain questions, but I'd be delighted to respond to any that you might have for me. Once again, to contact me, my last name, Rondello, at adelphi.edu. Again, pleasure to speak to you all, and I really appreciate the invitation of you having me.
Thank you very much, Professor Rondello. That was very insightful. Thank you for both presentations. I would like to also thank you for being patient while we sorted out connectivity issues, and I also apologize to the audience for having to cut short the Q&A session. But if you do have any questions, please feel free to either email them directly to Professor Rondello or post them in the Q&A or the chat, and we will try to facilitate communication that way as well. That brings us to the last speaker of the morning session. That will be Anjali Medina. If I can, I understand that we already have her among the panelists. So if I can maybe ask her to get ready while and again, I apologize that we kept you waiting. Anjali Medina has a broad background in disaster and emergency management. She's a nurse educator and has extensive experience working across clinical and disaster management and emergency fields. She's DRI certified business continuity professional and certified healthcare professional continuity practitioner. She's a member of TIEMS of the International Association of Emergency Managers and other local associations. She's currently based in the United States, and besides her extensive experience in nursing, she also has background and experience in public administration and is currently studying towards a Master of Arts at the American Military University. Her talk will focus on envisioning a sustainable transformation of Chechnya conflict to mitigate a humanitarian disaster.
Good afternoon and good morning for those who are joining us via Zoom from the Philippines. I would like to thank Dr. Harold, Dr. Roman, and the TIEMS for giving me the opportunity to present my topic on envisioning a sustainable transformation in Chechnya to mitigate future humanitarian disaster. The aim of my presentation is to discuss the conflict resolution theories and problem-solving workshop with the use of Track 1, Track 2 diplomacy recommended by the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, and also recommendation for sustainable transformation in Chechnya to mitigate further human rights by the International Crisis Group in Brussels. Now, let me start by saying that the Russian forces moved into Chechnya in 1830 to secure the empire from the Ottoman and conquered Chechnya in the 1850s. Following the collapse of the USSR in 1991, Chechnya declared its independence from the Soviet Union. Unlike Ukraine, Georgia, Uzbekistan, and former Soviet states, Chechnya was not considered one of the 15 official Soviet republics and was treated as one of many republics within the Russian Federation. Russian former President Boris Yeltsin, who permitted the dissolution of Soviet Union, did not allow the secession of a state within territorial Russia. In August 1991, a Soviet Air Force general and Chechen politician, Zokhar Dudayev, defeated Chechnya's local communist government and established an anti-Russian autocratic state to prevent a domino effect of Chechnya's secession that might lead to an independent movement of other republics within the Russian Federation. And to recover Chechnya's oil resources, Russian forces invaded Grozny on December 11, 1994. Grozny was retaken by the Chechen rebel, and a ceasefire was declared in August 1996. In 1999, the Kremlin condemned the bombing of apartment buildings in Moscow, linked to the Chechen Islamic militants, and accused Chechen President Aslan Mashadov as responsible for the death of an estimated 300 civilians. Following a series of bombing, President Yeltsin ordered a second invasion of Chechnya led by President Yeltsin's appointed successor, Prime Minister Vladimir Putin, that resulted in a protracted guerrilla warfare. According to the Mothers of Russia Soldiers Committee, 11,000 Russian soldiers died with over 12,000 wounded. The Chechen Committee for National Salvation reported between 20,000 and 40,000 people died and displaced 400,000 Chechen, with some 180,000 living in refugee camps in Ingushetia. Now, Chechnya is a republic in the southwestern Russia, bordered by Russia on the north, Dagestan Republic on the east, Georgia in the southwest, and Ingushetia on the west. Grozny, the capital of Chechnya, was flattened by the Russian army in 1994. The backbone of Chechnya's economy has been petroleum, natural gas, and agriculture. The petroleum refinery is located in Grozny, and the pipelines ran to the Caspian Sea at Mashekala and to the Black Sea at Tuapsa. Vladimir Putin appointed Ramzan Kadyrov, son of assassinated President Ahmad Kadyrov, as Chechnya's president. Ramzan Kadyrov's tenure is marked with serious human rights violations. The reasons for the conflict in Chechnya are the following. The Chechens resisted the rule of the Russian when Chechnya was annexed into the Russian Empire in the 19th century. During the Russian Revolution in 1917, Chechnya declared its independence. However, the independence movement was put down by the Red Army in 1920. In 1991, after Chechnya declared independence from the Russian Federation, right, the tension between Chechnya and Russia led to the First Chechen War in 1994. Russia supported the armed opposition group in Chechnya that attempted to overthrow Dudayev's government and bomb the capital city of Grozny, resulting in thousands of casualties and refugees. In 1997, Russia withdrew its troops, but remained to have a strong presence in the region and did not aid in the rebuilding after the war. Crimes and hostage-taking became rampant. The Kremlin condemned the bombing in Moscow and boycott Donetsk and blamed Chechen President Aslan Mashadov for the deaths of close to 300 civilians. Experts estimated that the war cost Moscow 100 million each month. The calamity was worse for Chechen, with an estimated 100,000 casualties, 400,000 displaced Chechens, in 180,000 living in refugee camps in Ingushetia. At the height of the bombing in Moscow, Prime Minister Vladimir Putin and his federal security services rose to power in the war against Chechnya and blamed the Chechens rebels or terrorists for the bombing. In 2000, Russia recaptured Grozny and declared a pro-Russian administration with Chechen Mufti Ahmad Kadyrov as president and Stanislav Ilyasov as prime minister. Mushadov denounced Kadyrov and led an underground Chechen forces. Although Europe condemned the human rights violation and cleansing operation, it did not take action to intervene in the conflict, as Putin claimed the conflict was a Russian internal affair. At that time, President Bush sought new relations with Russia in the aftermath of 9/11. The United Nations suspended its aid to Chechnya after the Chechen kidnapped a Russian aid worker in 2002. The U.S. Department reported an estimated 80,000 Chechen civilian deaths. The internationally funded Islamic terrorists raided the Russian territory, attempted to gain access to Russian nuclear munitions dumps, and returned to hostage-taking. The United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees reported that an estimated 350,000 Chechen continue to be displaced. In a show of dismay for the Russians, the Chechen fighters have joined forces with the Ukrainians, while the Russian supporters in Chechnya, known as Kadyrovsky or Kadyrovites, led by Ramzan Kadyrov, have joined the fight to fight the Ukrainians alongside with Russia. So the magnitude of humanitarian crisis. And according to the European Commission Humanitarian Aid, the second Chechen conflict with the Russian displaced over 270,000 people who fled to Ingushetia and Dagestan. An estimated 100,000 Chechens fled to the European Union. In addition, the conflict weakened the socio-economic infrastructure, resulting to a higher degree of desolation and humanitarian needs. Although the condition in Chechnya started to stabilize in 2005, with the large-scale reconstruction plan funded by the Russian federal budget, the government system failed to protect the basic rights of the Chechen citizens. In 2010, there was an estimated 7,000 Chechens still displaced in Ingushetia and under 3,000 in Dagestan. The international humanitarian aid between 1999 and 2007 became the lifeline for thousands of Chechens inside and outside the Chechen Republic. The European Commission has provided 239 million euros for food, shelter, clothing, water, sanitation, medical care, and legal protection support since 1999. through the EU's Department for Humanitarian Aid and Civil Protection. The three main phases in the humanitarian response adapting to evolving conditions and changing needs. From 1999 to 2001, provision for emergency relief aid during the Russian-Chechen conflict and peak of displacement. The ECHO provided 64 million euros. From 2000 to 2002 to 2004 marks 2 years of massive displacement and zero progress in reconstruction with the emergence of humanitarian needs. ECHO provided 83 million euros. Since 2005, humanitarian assistance takes a longer-term approach with focus on rehabilitation and return of displaced. ECHO that provided 92 million euros. In response to growing international involvement in internal conflicts, the Canadian government initiated the International Commission on Intervention and State Sovereignty that issued a report on the responsibility to protect human lives. UN Secretary General Kofi Annan commissioned a high-level panel on threats, challenges, and change, which generated a report on enlarger freedom that endorsed a responsibility to protect and enforcement action in its support if necessary by the Security Council. In September 2005, the World Summit affirmed the R2P, or the responsibility to protect principle. Many types of diplomacy have been introduced to find the best approach to conflict resolution, such as formal diplomacy, track 1 diplomacy, track 2 diplomacy, and multi-track diplomacy. The application of track 2 diplomacy on the use of force in Chechnya, facilitated by the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, aims to open communication between groups in conflict, develop creative approaches to differences in identity, discuss the root causes of violence and discontent, and encourage understanding of others. Recommendation for the transformation of conflict in Chechnya. This was recommended by the International Crisis Group in Brussels. Explore a long-term political solution and stability and sustainable transformation of the Chechen conflict by encouraging political dialogue with moderate political actors, allowing freedom of assembly and expression, ensuring the ability of activists, journalists, and scholars to operate safely, establishing a reconciliation commission to recognize the suffering of the victims, respect freedom of religion, and ensure separation of religion and state in Chechnya, promote economic recovery and mitigate corruption, create an independent inspection of federal funding and evaluation of feasibility of investment project, carry out a formal inquiry to examine alleged extortion and withholding of funds due to the public, as well as alleged double taxation of business and practices of hiring dead souls, and bring suspected perpetrators to justice, and then comply with the rule of law by ensuring adherence by law enforcement in Chechnya to the Russian constitution of laws. Stop collective punishment of the public and investigate suspected perpetrators to justice and rehabilitate victims. Prosecute public statements of hatred, threats of extrajudicial punishment of social groups, women, and activists. Implement European Court of Human Rights ruling and follow-up investigation to prevent violation of human rights. So those are the recommendations by the International Crisis Group in trying to do a transformation in Chechnya. Conclusion: the internationally funded Islamic terrorists made raids in the Russian territory. The Chechen rebels attacked military installation, economic infrastructure, and killed foreign aid workers. Does the end justify the means? By the same token, is the Russian invasion of Chechnya and humanitarian rights violation by the pro-Russian leader a just war, the doctrine of the just war can lead someone into thinking that because a war is just, it is good thing. It is a good thing. However, behind a war lies the idea that war is always bad. A just war may be permissible because it is a lesser evil, but it is still evil. According to UN Secretary General Kofi Annan and Western states, UK and Canada, sovereignty cannot be a license for states to massacre their citizens with impunity. Violence was acknowledged to be evil. However, so was the inaction in the face of injustice. In closing, I wish to quote from the Just War Theory, Ethics Guide on the Right Way for States to Act in a Conflict, which is not intended to justify wars, but to prevent wars by showing that going to war, except in limited circumstances, is wrong and motivates states to find other ways of resolving conflict. The Just War Theory attempts to reconcile three valuable points, such as taking a human life is seriously wrong. States have a duty to defend their citizens and justice, and protecting innocent human life and defending moral values at times require willingness to use force and violence. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your presentation. This concludes our morning session or mid-afternoon session. I terribly apologize for running over time and cutting into everybody's lunch hour. If you have any questions, please feel free to put them into the chat box or the Q&A. You can do that anytime now between now and the end of today. And we will now break for lunch and we will reconvene at 10 minutes to 2. And thank you very much. See you in the afternoon session.